Okay, good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about digital transformation of the construction industry. And essentially what's underpinning what I want to share with you today is that as we move forward and as we want to progress as firms and as an industry, to really unpack the case of the need for change, that technology does present solutions, or at least some solutions, but that even having a need and a solution, if we don't have a plan about how we're going to do it, doesn't really lead to progress. And even having all three of those, if we don't take a conscious decision and move to action, we won't make progress. So how do we actually then think about putting a plan together, and where do we start in terms of moving to action? So that's the ground I want to cover. I'm going to be talking to you for about 50 minutes or so. And I'm going to be talking about this. We all talk about technological disruption. It's like such a common subject for discussion at the moment. Then we share a few thoughts on the general principles of technological disruption, but then zoom into the construction industry and explore how it is ripe for change. Then to make the case that the technology of today is qualitatively different to the technology of 2 decades ago, and that it does really offer some very powerful solutions. Of course, digital transformation of any firm or any industry is not easy. So we need to make sure we understand the benefits and why we're doing it. But then it's a case of getting into, so what do we do? This plan that I spoke about, and I talk in general principles about digital transformation. Then again, I zoom into construction. And then I share some thoughts on, so where do we actually begin? So that's the ground I want to cover. And obviously starting off talking about technological disruption in general. Now, one couldn't talk about disruption in the midst of the South African third wave and not talk about COVID disruption and compare and contrast that in a way to technological disruption. And the metaphor I like to use is that of the so-called boiled frog. The story goes that if you take a frog and throw it into a pot of boiling water, the boiling water will be a shock to its system and the frog will jump out. And it may be a bit scalded, but essentially it will be okay. But if you take a frog and you put it into a pot of cold water and then gradually bring that pot of water to the boil, the frog, being cold-blooded, will not notice the shock of temperature to its system and won't jump out, but will eventually boil to death. And in a way, COVID has been like taking our businesses and throwing them into the pot of boiling water. And it has been a huge shock to our system. We have all responded profoundly. We've re-strategized, we've re-baselined, we've re-budgeted, we've transformed the way we operate. And we really, as a rule, firms they've been injured, let's put it that way, but generally we've survived because we responded to this impulse shock of COVID. Tech disruption, on the other hand, is a bit like putting our businesses into a pot of cold water, and eventually and gradually the technological water heats up. But it's a pervasive, persistent, gradual change, and we don't always notice it. And the risk is that we don't respond and we are left uncompetitive and irrelevant as the market evolves. So I would argue that if you look at the impact of technological change over the last 50 years, its impact is at least as big as the impact of the COVID disruption, which is the single biggest shock to the global economy that we've had over 50 years. But tech disruption cumulatively is as profound. Now that's a bold claim. Let me try and justify that claim a little bit. And I'm going to use the narrative of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Japanese Society 5.0 narrative, which I'm sure we are all familiar with. The Japanese, as is often the case with Eastern cultures, they tend to take a longer view of history. And they start off with a hunting society, what they called Society 1.0. And then we learned to domesticate animals and cultivate crops, and we became the agrarian society or the agricultural society. And then we invented the Gutenberg press and the steam engine and the mill and so on. And we became the industrial society, which those of you who've looked at the Fourth Industrial Revolution will realize that really corresponds to the so-called first and second industrial revolution. First industrial revolution, remember steam and so on. The second industrial revolution, electricity, the internal combustion engine, production science. And then we got electronics and computers, which gave rise to the information society, which is the same as the third industrial revolution. And now we have artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, pervasive mobility, big data, virtual and augmented reality. I could go on. And those technologies have brought us into the threshold of what the Japanese call Society 5.0, or in Europe is typically called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Now, there's two key points I want to make with this. The first is the point of acceleration. So we evolved to be modern human beings about 250,000 years ago, but it was only in 8000 BC that we learned to domesticate animals and cultivate crops. And then it was only in about 1600 AD with the invention of the Gutenberg press, which democratized reading and writing, gave rise to the spread of knowledge, which triggered the industrial revolutions. And then it was in 1980 that essentially computers entered the world at scale, and electronics and miniaturization of electronics really reached maturity. And that brings us to today, essentially. And the 2 points I want to make is the first is acceleration. And we see society 1 lasted 240,000 years, 2, 10,000 years, society 3, 400 years, society 4, 40 years. So whereas in the past, we've always had generations to respond to technological change, now the technological change is sweeping over us and changing the world in the space of half a generation to a generation, which places huge pressure on individuals and societies, but most importantly on businesses to respond. We don't have the luxury of gradually assimilating and adapting to new technology in an era of such profound accelerating technological change. But the second point I want to make is to justify the point that technological change is indeed as profound and is at least cumulatively as impactful as the COVID disruption. And the point is that each of these transitions from society 1 to society 2 was triggered essentially by technological innovation, the ability to domesticate animals and cultivate crops. From 2 to 3, the Gutenberg press, the steam engine, and some other inventions. From 3 to 4, within society 3, of course, it was the internal combustion engine, electricity, and production science. And then the computer and electronics, and now I've mentioned Internet of Things, big data, artificial intelligence, and so on. So over the ages, technology has powered fundamental shifts in society, in economies, and therefore in business. And this transition that we are now going through is as profound as those previous transitions. The only difference is it's happening in the space of half a generation. The second point I want to make when considering the general perspectives of disruption is that no one is immune. The Global Center for Digital Business Transformation described what they call the digital vortex. That yes, there are some firms and industries that are already in the eye of the vortex: media, ICT, telecoms, retail, and financial services. And as little as 3 years ago, I would speak to people in retail and financial services, and they would say, no, we'll be okay. Tech's not going to affect us in South Africa the same way as it has affected retail or financial services abroad. They've learned that that is not true. Then there's another group of industries: hospitality, transportation, education, professional services, and consumer packaged goods that are being drawn into this vortex already, but they're not in it yet. And then, of course, there's another group of industries: healthcare, manufacturing, energy and utilities, real estate and construction, and agriculture, that this perspective from the Global Center for Digital Business Transformation, which is now 4 years old, by the way, says they've got a bit more time to plan. This is the global perspective. When I was doing some work for the Fourth Industrial Revolution South Africa initiative for the presidency, we analyzed South African industries. And on the vertical, this is a complex chart, but on the vertical axis here, you see the exposure to technological disruption. On the horizontal axis, you see the contribution to the economy, and the size of the bubble represents the number of jobs. So according to the Stats SA data, you see construction in the middle of this chart here. It is not as exposed as the previous chart as ICT or banking or retail, but there is some exposure to being technologically disrupted. It is a very important contributor to the South African economy, contributing more than 500 billion rand. And importantly, it employs, judging from the size of the bubble, about 700,000 people. The point being is when I speak to people, and over the last 3 years since we did this analysis, construction has probably moved up in terms of its exposure to technological disruption to above the halfway mark on this scale. Now, the final point I want to make by way of introduction to disruption is when we think of disruption, we tend to think of the likes of COVID, that the whole business was wiped out by technological innovation. But there is a different perspective I'd like to share with you, and that comes from my background. Those of you that have read my CV, I used to work in telecom. And telecom is an interesting case in disruption. What we see in the case of telecom is that from about 2008 to 2013, there you see the share price going from a high of just on 100 Rand to a low of 11 Rand. And what happened during this period, yes, there were some big strategic mistakes. We disposed our interest in Vodacom. We had a big investment which failed in Nigeria, and we weren't keeping customers happy. But underlying this, at the heart of it, there was a slow decline of our core business brought about by technological change in the market and our inability to capture new business. Now, the point I want to make here is we see that the share price lost 90% of its value, and anybody who's been in a firm in that position knows how disruptive it is. That is truly disruptive. So we see in this table, the share price went from 99 Rand 50 to 11 Rand 96, which is a CAGR of minus 40% per year. At the same time, our revenue, on the other hand, only went from 37 billion down to 33 billion over the same period, which is a CAGR of only 2%. So the point I want to make here is you don't have to be a Kodak to be disrupted. Market change and not responding to market change, which leads to even a modest decline of like 2% a year, can be truly disruptive. And I've personally lived through the impact of that disruption. And it was only when we actually started doing things here, like launching mobile, fixing some of the mistakes in our customer service, that we were able to start this turnaround, which has since continued. So technological disruption is something that we all need to take very seriously. Let me now move on to the construction industry and briefly make the case that it is ripe for change. And start off with this, that says, if we look at the construction industry globally, over the last 20 years, it has really stagnated. If we compare it, even, people used to say manufacturing was pretty optimized. There was not much we could do with technology to improve manufacturing. You see the productivity growth in global manufacturing has doubled, 100% improvement over the last 20 years, whereas construction has broadly stayed flat. And if you get data for the US, we have data which goes back another 40 years. The construction industry, the productivity levels have completely stagnated for the last 50 years in the US, and we have data to prove that that's pretty much the case even in construction. So the industry is not moving forward. Now, the interesting thing is that creates both a challenge and an opportunity, because the productivity, let me just go back to this slide. If construction had grown even at the rate of the overall economy, not even manufacturing, if construction's productivity had grown at the same rate as the global economy, the difference in productivity is 1.6 trillion US dollars. And then if we look at that across regions in the world, we see that this productivity gap to what is possible in the broader economy represents $30 billion. That's 450 billion Rand across Africa. If the construction industry could get its levels of productivity just to mirror those of the overall global economy in terms of the improvement over the last 20 years. So this makes the industry, it challenges the industry, but it suggests there's an opportunity, a financial one. There's a second reason why I would suggest the industry is ripe for change. If we look at the sort of the two deep-rooted challenges in construction is cost overruns and schedule overruns. And what you see here is some data which shows on the vertical axis, the overrun in capital expenditure, and on the horizontal axis, the delays. And yes, there are many projects that have only modest cost overruns and delays, but you'll see on average, the delay beyond the original schedule is 20 months, some much worse than that. And on average, projects overrun on cost by 80%. And this clearly, if you're overrunning on, if you're in a low margin industry where your margins are typically single-digit percentages and you have cost overruns, it's very problematic. And of course, cost and time overruns are not good for customer satisfaction. Really compelling reasons to say, is there a way to do it differently? Now, I would argue part of the reason why this is, when we look at digital transformation across sectors and whether they've transformed the assets, how they use them, and transformed the way they do work, looking across assets usage and labor, and across the different sectors in the world, we see that construction is one of the most untransformed industries from a technological perspective across the world. Now, no one has sort of firmly attributed, let's call it causality to this, that says we're seeing this productivity gap that I mentioned, we're seeing the cost overruns and the time overruns because there is, how should we say, a suspicious coincidence in this. I know the industry's got its own dynamics, is that the construction industry has historically and continues to invest far less in IT and technology. So if that was not enough, the fact that productivity has stagnated, that there's a systemic problem of cost overruns and schedule overruns, that it's an untransformed industry from a digital perspective. On top of that, there are some mega trends that have the potential to profoundly impact the industry. And I'm not going to go through the details of bullets in the chart, but I think we all know how markets and customers are changing. Infrastructure's aging, population growth is faster than capacity growth in the construction sector. The sustainability agenda has risen right to the top of board level considerations across industries, the so-called ESG agenda. Society and the way we engage with the workforce is changing. And of course, there's always ever evolving politics and regulatory pressures on our business. And then on top of even that, the industry itself recognizes that besides just cost overruns and schedule overruns, there's big challenges in managing risk because profit margins are low. I've spoken about the time and budget. Now, every day you open the newspaper and there's some new cyber attack somewhere in the world. And of course, workforce safety is a really key concern. And this isn't limited to one part of the construction process. The industry players themselves, so this comes from a survey of global construction executives, that almost every phase of the life cycle, from design and development through to handover and turnover, can be significantly improved. And then came COVID. And this has really exacerbated the challenges across the industry. And even before COVID, 90% of industry experts believed that the industry needs to change, and that the need was more acute than 5 years ago, and that over the next 2 decades, the industry will look radically different. Today, post-COVID, 2/3 think that COVID will accelerate it dramatically to be less than 2 decades. And half of the global construction leaders believe that they have already increased their investments to accept this. And one piece of research suggests that, interestingly, that the bulk of the pandemic-driven challenges can be solved by technology. So I started off by talking about COVID as one sort of disruption and technological disruption as a different sort of disruption. This suggests, in fact, that technological change is an answer to COVID disruption. So from low, stagnant productivity, persistent cost and schedule overruns, low levels of prevailing digital transformation, and other systemic challenges facing the business, the question is, can technology offer a solution? And I'm sure many of you would, in a way I'm preaching to the converted, that it offers some solutions. What I want to make the case is it potentially offers the route of transformative solutions. Now, if we look at why capital projects fail, Deloitte have this view that there's a whole lot of reasons that the delivery strategy and approach isn't suited to the project risk profile or what the client has capability to actually operate, that there's role confusion between the client and delivery, that owners overstretch their capabilities and construction companies overstretch their capabilities. And it often comes down to leadership. And at the same time, there's these complexities of the society that we're operating in that we really only get our legitimacy from being afforded that by the society that we're in. We have weak IT systems, so we don't get the right blend of technology and analytics, which gives us poor performance of visibility. And if we don't have good visibility, we can't have the right governance and controls. Put all that together, we end up with these cost overruns, we end up with inappropriate projects, we end up with schedule delays. Now, if we look at this, what we see is that clearly technology plays a role in the weak IT systems. That is one of the root causes. But if the technology is also a solution to getting better visibility of performance across the value chain, which then underpins getting better governance. And it helps us having better visibility of what's working, what's not working, who's performing, who's not performing, where we need to take remedial action in advance. And I'm going to come back to that. And on the basis of all that, the insight to get a better delivery strategy. So what we see in all of this, that tech is at least part of the solution across the value chain to addressing the fundamental underlying reasons why capital projects fail. Now, some of you might say, oh, but tech's been with us. Brian, you mentioned it. We had the Industrial Revolution from 1980. Tech's been with us for 40 years already. I want to make the argument that the fourth industrial revolution technologies are game-changing relative to the third, as were the third at their time. The 4IR technologies for some sectors actually are the technologies that make change possible and real. Whereas the third industrial revolution was about computing, networking, the internet, initial mobility, and things like enterprise resource planning and management systems. The fourth industrial revolution is about cloud, and it's about 4 and 5G mobility and building information modeling and virtual reality, and I've spoken about this. And it is all of these technologies, I'm going to come back to the platforms one. It is these technologies which actually take computing and networking and the internet and mobility and make it useful in a form for firms outside the tech sector. So whereas it was, computers have been in the back office for a long time, it is these technologies which take technology out of the back office and put it into your core operational processes and your front office, so to speak. And most importantly, this emergence of technology platforms, which really integrate all of this, are the game changer, that it is actually provides a way of cobbling together and weaving together an array of complex emerging technologies to do real world jobs in the physical domain. And that is what has been game changing about the so-called fourth industrial revolution. The cyber-physical society, as it's called, is about blurring the edges between what happens in the physical world and the cyber world. The third industrial revolution created the cyber world. The fourth industrial revolution links the cyber world, cyberspace, to the physical world. which is where the construction industry operates. And that's why I believe the fourth industrial revolution technologies are game changing. The people who often have the best view of where real change is happening are venture capitalists. And if we look at venture capital in the construction sector, let's go back 10 years and index the level of venture capital deployed into different industries. And what we see is the deployment of venture capital into construction tech has completely outstripped venture capital into other sectors. And by the way, this is across all parts of the value chain. But the interesting thing is the biggest level of investment and the highest number of investments is actually in the construction sector itself. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, this is where cyberspace is being made real in physical space. And that's why I think this term of the cyber-physical society or the fourth industrial revolution, the time is now for the construction. Well, not now, it's the next decade. This next decade is going to be the manifestation of this in the construction industry. And the venture capitalists are seeing that, that's for sure. And what's interesting about this, and from that previous slide, we can see that there's all sorts of investments being made in construction tech, from some fairly out there stuff like 3D printing of components and self-healing materials, or some pretty stuff that's already with us, like drones. So it's got a high likelihood, but the impact will be modest. But the key thing is at the top of this chart, it's certain, it's not a maybe, and it's going to have a huge impact, is integrated building information modeling systems. And I'm going to come back to that as well. And I think the other final point I want to say about technology having a potential to impact this market is, again, it isn't limited to a single phase of the industry and is not limited to a particular, let's call it layer or application layer. At the heart of it, we've got mobility and mobile interfaces. We've got building information modeling, typically in the cloud. We've got the underlying big data and analytics platform, and we've got ubiquitous connectivity and awareness with tracking. On top of that, we can build our management and decision support systems. We can build simulation and virtual reality to improve the confidence of what we're doing earlier in the life cycles of the project. But on top of that, we can build these digital physical interfaces, whether it is 3D scanning or Internet of Things sensors through to modular and prefabricated construction. And all of these solutions play a role, but as we'll see later, the logical part that we need to start to build out is at this middle layer of the platform, the software platform and the control mechanisms around that. Of course, we need to make sure that we have the appropriate technology, strategy, and capabilities to integrate this. And of course, cybersecurity is really important. So I've so far made the case that the world is being disrupted by technology, that the construction industry particularly is ripe for change, and that tech potentially offers many solutions to these challenges. But we need to make sure we understand the benefits, because change is not easy and it does take resources. It costs money. So what are the benefits? So firstly, let's look, before we zoom into construction, generally, what we see is that digitally transformed across industries perform better across key financial metrics. So let me explain this chart. This chart is really a typical 2x2 matrix of what would be called digital maturity. Digital intensity on the vertical axis is about how much you've actually done with technology. And leadership intensity is about leadership's attitude to technological change, the vision, their governance, how they drive it in their organizations, and how they empower their organizations. So, of course, digital leaders are in the top right-hand quadrant, digital laggards are in the bottom left-hand quadrant. What we see is that digital leaders across sectors, and this was a survey of hundreds of firms around the world in different sectors, digital leaders outperform laggards by 13% on revenue, by 50% on profit, and by almost 20% in terms of market value. So there is compelling evidence across sectors that digital transformation has real financial return on investment. In sort of even more compelling, solid economic evidence, this is some data that was tucked away in one of the annexes of the International Monetary Fund's 2019 Outlook report. And they show that firms in digitally intensive industries can charge double the markup relative to firms in non-digitally transformed industries. Now imagine an industry that is making on average single percentage point profit margins, the ability to increase markup on the basis of digital transformation. That is potentially hugely disruptive. Another piece of very solid economic research was done by a professor at Stanford University called Mordecai Kurtz. And he looked at the 4,200 firms listed in the United States, and he found very compelling evidence. He went so far as to say there is demonstrated cause and effect that firms that are the most transformed by IT create more surplus wealth for their shareholders than firms that are not transformed by IT. And surplus wealth, he defined, is essentially your market cap minus your net asset value, essentially. And he makes the case, and he goes so far as to say, if you are increase your level of IT transformation, you will increase the wealth creation for your shareholders. So this is general data across sectors. If we zoom into construction and look at the big picture, so it's a really important industry for the world's economy. $10 trillion a year and 6% of the global GDP. BCG estimates that if we were to do full-scale digitalization of the non-residential construction industry, you would get approximately $1 trillion of savings across the industry in the engineering construction phases. And let's call it $500 billion post-construction in the operations phase. And that's really important because those firms that actually do this, as they say, it will enable efficiency and quality gains, but that will lead to a reshuffling of the competitive league table. So again, what we're seeing, and we see it in the general sectors, is that digital leaders increase their competitiveness, increase their market influence, and actually increase their market power. And digital laggards are left scrambling for, you could say, the scraps, and are less competitive and less profitable. And we're seeing that in construction as well. There are qualitative benefits at a more granular level. I think we've spoken about improved productivity. We've spoken about how collaboration is a big part to achieving the improved productivity, significant benefits in safety management and risk management, and we've spoken about the cost. And again, what construction industry leaders around the world say, they believe that digital transformation, the biggest impact will be in project management and performance. But look at this, improving health and safety, very material benefits, and then a lot of benefits across all parts of the value chain. Now you might say, okay, but Brian, I want to see some numbers. I want to actually see how this manifests in sort of real use cases. So from the World Economic Forum's report, if we could zoom into some different case studies of construction, and we look at how technology actually impacts on the case study and the financial impact. And let's firstly look at a vertical construction case. So a 5-story office building of 10,000 square meters. Life cycle used data-driven construction, planning, lean execution, and rigorous construction monitoring and surveillance. This study found that there's a potential 15% saving on the life cycle cost of this example, where that is in 12% of that is in the construction phase and 18% saving in the operations phase. If we look at infrastructure construction, so a highway of 100 kilometers long with 4 bridges over 35 years, again, based on building information modeling. Here also bringing in autonomous and automated construction and using condition monitoring and predictive maintenance in the operate phase. We see a cost saving of 16% over the life cycle, but almost 20% of that is in the construction phase. If we look at industrial construction, a power plant, a combined gas turbine plant with a 25-year lifetime, again using BIM through the life cycle, and data-driven construction and planning, and then also using digital techniques in the operations phase, we see a 12% life cycle cost saving, 14% of that in the construction phase. So these are very material savings. And in an industry that has historically made low margins, these can be truly transformative. And for those that do not do it, the risk is that the competitive league table will be juggled around, leaving firms really no option. Okay, so let's move on now to how do we respond? And we're going to look at this both in terms of general principles, as I did with the benefits, and then zoom into how we do it in construction. So there's a huge body of work that's been done on digital transformation and digital maturity, and I'm going to summarize that on 2 slides. The process of digital transformation is essentially summarized as following: that there's this technological change happening outside of our organizations, which is accelerating, as indicated by this increasing pink arrow. Our organizations are going on as we've always operated before. And the trajectory leads to a bigger gap between the technology that's available and that which we actually use. So technological transformation, really, or digital transformation, any complex change processes requires our organizations to unfreeze, to make the change, and then to refreeze to a new normal where we lock in a position of constant agility and constant adaptation to this technological change. And it's this process that is called digital transformation. And we can make it complex, and we can talk about 12-step models and 10-step models to do this. But ultimately, the key is to unfreeze, that's recognize the need to change and unfreeze the organization. Make deliberate changes on a strategic basis, and then refreeze into a new normal of perpetual agility. And as we do that, we need to measure where we are now. It's what we call our digital maturity now, and how we're progressing. But most importantly, we need to have this aspiration of where we need to get to. This is those digital leaders that I was talking about, who make more revenue and more profit and create more shareholder value. So digital maturity unpacks what it takes to be a digital leader. So how do we think about, what are all the factors that we have to get right to be digitally mature? And when we go across all the consultancy literature, all the business literature, and the academic literature, what we actually consolidate is we find that we want to achieve business results, and digital transformation affects those directly in the customer domain, the product domain, the operations domain, and the workforce domain. It also can be achieved by new value streams. And particularly if we get our digital ethics wrong, it can destroy business results. What underpins these, though, is what's really important. We will not get any of that right without the right IT platform and the right technology platforms. And we will not get any of it right without skills. Those are 2 critically enabling conditions to achieve the organizational change necessary to achieve the business results. And those, in turn, require the right innovation architecture in the firm, the right organization and governance structures for the transformation program, which in turn rest on the right vision and strategy for digital transformation, and a culture that embraces and enables it. Now, the point I want to make here, and we will see this, is that it starts with leadership decisions and putting in place the right practices. But you could call it the 2 foundational elements are the skills and the IT platforms which make it happen. This isn't my personal perspective. This is a distillation of the academic and business literature, as well as practical experience over all industries in the world. So now, how do we apply this to construction? Well, I think the first thing we need to recognize is that no firm exists in isolation. And ultimately, the industry will evolve. The firms that evolve faster will be those that achieve superior competitive advantage. But we do need to recognize that government needs to embrace technological change as well, and can certainly set the agenda in how it procures, as well as how it regulates and the policies it applies. The sector needs to respond through recognizing that there's ecosystems of responses that will really be important to actually drive the industry forward, and that there are certain non-competitive things that the industry can do together. And one of those is joint industry marketing. But then at the company level, we'll see it is about people, it is about technology, it is about process, and it is about strategy, which actually sets where you want to be, which defines the digital maturity roadmap for the firm, and then creates the enabling conditions and the direction for the transformation of the people, the process, and the technology. Now, in terms of change management practices, I've spoke about the generic thing of unfreeze, make the change, and refreeze, where McKinsey has said, for the construction industry specifically, they talk about the bold aspiration. So this is about understanding where you are, where you want to be, and set it out in a very clear, detailed way about how you want to get there. But you need to make sure that you get momentum. Any transformation effort has skeptics. Rapid results do matter. They neutralize skeptics and they energize the broader organization. So finding a few particular, well-defined, well-bound, doable projects where you can get some quick wins. Unfortunately, the reality is that digital transformation costs money and it costs even more effort. So you need to focus people on the task with dedicated task teams, but you do need to invest in the foundational platforms. Those skills and the IT platforms that I mentioned on this slide here, these require significant investment. And then finally, it is about, this requires ecosystem change. It requires a significant break from the past. And to do that, to do it alone is really hard. And therefore find a coalition of the willing, so to speak. Find the right partners to work with you who share the vision. Some of them will be upstream in the value chain, some will be downstream in the value chain. But finding with the right partners is important to make this possible. Now, this is about technology. So just to come back to where technology can play a role immediately. So this again comes back to that where the venture capitalists are actually seeing the real opportunity now. And so in this chart, you see across all different areas, field productivity, the venture capitalists believe that that is ripe now. Engineering and design tools second, facility management and improvement third, capital strategy and portfolio optimization fourth, planning and scheduling, performance management and advanced visualization. This is where the people who I believe are always a good weather vane of where the industry's at, the venture capitalists, say that the technology can help right now. The final point in terms of where to start for the construction industry is, I think, comes from this World Economic Forum report. What are the most important transformation areas now? And across the industry, people believe, firstly, it's people, and secondly, it's technology. So if that is, and by the way, that's very consistent with the previous slides that we've shown. It is also, by the way, entirely consistent with this general model for digital maturity, which talks about people and technology. So if we're going to talk about first steps, we need to talk about first steps around people and technology. So people, let me talk about skills first. And the question that often gets asked is, so what are the skills for the digital age? And I'm not going to go, I haven't got time to go through all the research, but whether we look at the popular literature, there's skills, these are the skills for the digital age. LinkedIn says different skills are relevant for the digital age. The consultancies say, yes, you need business and science skills and human skills and technology skills. The World Economic Forum says you need to focus on the so-called soft skills that you see here. McKinsey makes the point that what we're seeing is a shift across industries, by the way, from manual and physical abilities and basic cognitive tasks towards higher cognitive tasks, social and emotional abilities, and technological abilities. Now, you might say, how does this apply to the construction industry? Well, when we build a more comprehensive framework for skills for the digital world, we see that absolutely the so-called the ICT skills are going to grow in importance. From mobile app development, DevOps, cloud, through to coding, these are going to be really important, as are the proper digital skills, whether it's omni-channel, social media, digital marketing, through to things like robotic process automation or lean innovation and AI science. But the reality is at the moment, less than 10% of the world's workforce is employed here, and this might even go to 20 or 30%. But what about the rest? What are the skills they need for the digital world? Probably the most important one is using technology to do your traditional job more effectively and finding ways of doing that using available technologies. So it's about being an engineer and having really good traditional functional and vocational skills, whether you're an accountant or an engineer or a quantity surveyor or an operator, but understanding how to use the digital tools that you have to do your job differently and better. Yes, the soft skills are growing in importance. And yes, the digital foundational skills of being able to just be comfortable and familiar and effective in a digital world are really important. Now, people in South Africa will say, but Brian, we have two issues here. We need to build the skills, and then we can actually think about buying, getting all the systems in place. I'm going to come back to that. And the other skill is they say, but Brian, half of South Africa's workforce lack the basic digital literacy. And that is an issue. But I would argue that these things, by the way, can be taught. And there are 8 million employees in South Africa, let's call it, who are disempowered by being on the wrong side of the digital divide. It is not rocket science to fix that. And I believe that firms have an obligation, a moral and a social obligation, to improve the digital literacy of their staff. But more importantly, there's a huge self-benefit in that, because once you improve the digital literacy of your staff, they can participate and be productive members of a digitally transformed organization. But let's come back to this one. The question I want to ask you is, what comes first, the tool or the skill? So do you say we're going to train our people in BIM and integrated information management and data analytics and so on, and then we'll buy the system? Or do you say, actually, we need to buy the system that we can acquire the skill? And the metaphor I'd like to use, I'm a sort of a wannabe musician. And the metaphor I'd like to use is, if I say, I want to become a good guitarist, I'm going to learn how to do that, and then I'm going to buy my guitar. Do you think I'll ever become a competent guitarist doing it that way? Of course not. The way you become competent at something is you get the instrument, you learn the theory, and you put it into practice day after day after day. And my view is the way to acquire these skills here, which are at the heart of digital transformation, is to get the necessary basic tools and then put them into practice, learn the theory and put them into practice. So that brings me then to the tool and the technology. I really just want to share with you one key slide on this. And that is that what the critical ingredient, I've shared with you over a few slides up to now, that the place to start, the critical ingredient, is life cycle wide integrated building information modeling. And why is that? Firstly, it's the foundation to transform decision making and risk management. So if we consider a project across the plan, design, build, operate timeline, we recognize that the ability to change decreases as you go and move forward in time, and the cost of changes rises on this chart. And that historically, the number of changes have really been sort of followed this pattern, that it's during the build phase that we realize, oh dear, we need to change this, we need to change that. What integrated BIM allows is it allows us to shift changes to earlier in the life cycle. And you can imagine the transformative impact of that on the ability to reduce cost, reduce risk, and improve on-time delivery. And integrated BIM makes this shift possible. So therefore, it's a good place to start. The other thing that it does is it's the foundation to call what I call intractable paradoxes. You can dissolve them, not solve them, but they actually just go away and actually get changed. Conventional wisdom has it. If you speak to marketing people and production science people, they say you can have any two of these. You can have fast and good, or fast and cheap, or good and cheap, but you can't have all three together. That's conventional wisdom. The digital perspective, indeed, on the other hand, turns that on its head and says that fast, good, and cheap is the sweet spot of digitally transformed organizations, whether that is in knowledge work, manufacturing, or in other industries like construction. So my view is the place to start when we talk about first steps is building the BIM. And why is that? What is the underlying reason there? The underlying reason is it's all about data. It is about finding the right platform and structure to unlock the value of data. Now, I know I might have a few CFOs on the call, and I've spoken to CFOs and they say, but Brian, show me the value of data? We don't see it. And if I was to ask you, so what is the firm in the world that best represents an organization that has been able to unlock the value of data? I think most people would agree it's Google. But let's look at Google's balance sheet, which you see here. And let's zoom in to their current assets, and we can even zoom in to intangibles. You don't see value of data anywhere. But what's interesting is we see then total intangible assets of $22 billion US, total assets of $320 billion US, but a market cap of $1.7 trillion US. And essentially, the value of data is a big part of that $1.4 trillion, which makes Alphabet so valuable. So we don't see it on the balance sheet, but we see it in the ability of the firm to create value. And that's why the platforms which make data manageable and help us to extract value from it. Lots of people have lots of data. So every telcos have lots of data, but they don't know how to extract value from it. 3 slides to finish off. I think what we've seen generally is that technology almost always follows this pattern of an exponential growth. So here we see global mobile data usage, and we see this exponential pattern. And what's interesting is here around 2006, 7, 8, the pattern was really happening. It was just below the radar screen. It was below the noise level. And the important point about this is that this data-based world is moving exponentially. But the way we think and the way our traditional organizations have operated is still very linear. And the problem is in this phase here, when it's below the radar, the industries are typically in a mode of complacency. But then suddenly the exponential trend becomes visible and the industry gets disrupted. And once you get to this point, it's too late to respond. And historically, the construction industry has been here. And we are moving along this part of the curve. And the future will belong to those firms who actually respond in a strategic and agile way, and who respond sooner rather than later. Let me finish off by saying, it's easy to say that, but there will always be, when we're in an industry, it's difficult to see what's actually happening. So let me finish off with these 10 people and ask you, who are they and what do they have in common? And what's interesting, besides the fact that they're all distressingly pale and male, what's interesting is that they were all at the inside of an industry who had the best seat in the house, who were experts in their field, and dismissed change when it came along. So from William Orton said, the telephone would never be more than an interesting toy. The founder of 20th Century Fox said the TV set wouldn't be able to hold on to any sustained market share. The president of IBM said that there wasn't a market for computers, as did the founder of the Digital Equipment Corporation, another computer company. Said there's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. Robert Metcalfe, who co-invented the Ethernet, by the way, said the internet would spectacularly go supernova and collapse. Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft after Bill Gates, said Google, it's not a company, it's a house of cards. Two people from Nokia, the chief strategy officer at Nokia and the chief executive of RIM, who used to do BlackBerries, as you will recall, said the iPhone was going to be just another phone and was going to transform that industry. Now the president of IBM said Amazon, interesting, but not really a big competitor. And of course, my favorite, the CEO of Blockbuster, said Netflix wasn't even on their radar screen. So what we see is sort of every technological innovation of the last century, people inside the industry have said, no, it's not going to affect our industry. And what all these people actually have in common is denial. And the first step to a successful digital transformation is actually overcoming the denial and moving on to pushing the on button and actually getting moving with the digital transformation effort, which is tailored for our particular organizations. And in the case of the construction industry, my firm view is that starts with creating the right information architecture and platform, which at its heart has the BIM as the place to start. So thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to me. And I hope we can unpack this further in the panel discussion and the conversation to follow. So Kim, back to you briefly.